You walk into a car dealership, excited to buy your dream car. But instead of getting treated like a valued customer, you're kicked out simply because of the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened to one black man, but the next day, he returns in a way no one could have ever expected. The revenge he takes will leave you speechless. This story begins with a black man, ready to make a big purchase at a car dealership. He's hopeful, eager to make a deal, but what happens next will make your blood boil. The white manager, seeing only the color of his skin, assumes he can't afford the car. He belittles him, insults him, and then kicks him out of the dealership. The man leaves quietly, but what happens the very next day will shock you. He comes back not as a customer, but as the new owner. It was a typical morning at the car dealership, but for James, it was supposed to be a special day. He had saved for months, scoured through different models, and finally found the perfect car that was going to mark a major achievement in his life. The only thing left was the deal. But little did he know, what should have been a simple transaction would turn into a nightmare. James had walked into the dealership, dressed well, with a clear plan. He knew what he wanted. The salespeople were already busy with other customers, but he didn't mind. He was patient. That was until he was approached by the manager Tom, a middle-aged white man who had been running this dealership for years. The moment Tom laid eyes on James, something in his demeanor shifted. It wasn't just the usual sales pitch or friendly approach. There was something more to it, a look that said, "You don't belong here." Tom didn't bother with the usual greeting. Instead, he sized James up, clearly making assumptions based solely on his appearance. It wasn't hard to spot the uncomfortable shift in Tom's body language. He didn't offer his hand for a handshake like he had with the white customers before. Instead, he raised an eyebrow as if questioning why a black man would walk into his dealership, expecting to make a purchase. "I'll be honest with you, we're not really running any big sales today," Tom said, his voice laced with condescension. "But I'm sure we can find something within your budget." James felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't just the words Tom said. It was the way he said them, the judgment behind his tone. Tom had already decided, without even asking a single question, that James wasn't the kind of customer worth engaging with. This was no longer a simple transaction. It was a moment where the color of James' skin determined his worth. Trying to brush off the discomfort, James calmly asked about a particular car he had been eyeing online. Tom's response wasn't what he expected. Instead of showing interest or directing him to the vehicle, Tom waved him off dismissively. "That one? Well, I'm sure you wouldn't be able to afford it. We have some other cars, more your style," Tom said, eyes narrowing as if the words were meant to belittle James, forcing him into a corner. James paused for a moment, a mix of disbelief and anger building inside him. He had never been treated this way, not in any other dealership, not in any other store for that matter. It wasn't just the rude comments. It was the assumption that he didn't have the means to buy a car just because of his skin color. But the situation was about to take an even uglier turn. Tom, seeing that James wasn't taking the bait, escalated things further. His tone grew harsher, and he made it clear that James wasn't welcome. "Listen," Tom said, his voice now full of arrogance. "Maybe this isn't the place for you. Why don't you go check out a cheaper lot? Somewhere more suited to your needs?" James stood there, stunned. The manager had just kicked him out. But it wasn't just about the rejection of his purchase. It wasn't just about the car that would have been his if treated with respect. What hurt the most was the blatant racism Tom had shown. James knew it, and deep down, Tom knew it too. This wasn't just about business, it was about keeping people like James out of spaces they deemed unfit for them. Tom's words echoed in his mind, ringing in his ears as he walked out of the dealership. But James wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't about to quietly accept the humiliation that Tom had just put him through. This wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination, but it was the first time it had happened so boldly in a place where people were supposed to be treated equally. As James stepped out of the dealership, he had a mix of emotions running through him. He felt furious, but he also felt determined. Determined to make sure Tom's actions didn't go unpunished. But more than anything, he was heartbroken by the reality that even today, in a modern society, some people still believed that their prejudices gave them power over others. For James, the problem wasn't just the manager's blatant racism. It was the system that allowed people like Tom to treat others as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. It was the systemic issue that ran deeper than one man's actions. It was the culture of discrimination that persisted in many industries, and dealerships were no exception. The challenges James faced weren't just about finding the right car anymore. They were about proving his worth, despite the roadblocks people like Tom would place in his way. He had fought hard to get where he was, to be in a position where he could afford to buy the car of his dreams. But the biggest hurdle was realizing that, no matter how hard he worked, people like Tom would always look at him and see something less than deserving. But James wasn't going to let the setback define him. Instead of walking away in defeat, he stood tall, holding on to his dignity, promising himself that he would find a way to make things right. James walked out of the dealership, his mind a whirl of emotions. He had been humiliated, his dignity trampled upon, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The moment Tom had dismissed him, it became personal. It wasn't just about being kicked out of a business, it was about something much bigger. It was about racism, about the subtle and overt ways people were judged and mistreated because of the color of their skin. For James, this was not just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of something much deeper and more pervasive. And it wasn't something he could let slide. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let Tom's actions go unchallenged. He had faced racism before, but this time it felt different. The way Tom had looked at him, the way he had treated him with such blatant disregard, made James realize just how deep these prejudices ran. But he wasn't angry for himself alone. He was angry for every other person who had ever been discriminated against and humiliated like that. James spent the night thinking about the situation, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. What was it about Tom that made him so sure he had the power to dismiss James? What made him believe that his position at the dealership granted him the right to assume James couldn't afford a car, simply because he was black? It was more than just the car. It was about the belief that someone like James didn't belong in that space, that he didn't deserve the same treatment as others. And it was a belief that many people shared, even if they didn't say it out loud. The next morning, James woke up with a plan. He wasn't just going to file a complaint or let this slide under the rug. He was going to turn the tables on Tom, on the dealership, and on the very system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He knew the odds were against him. He wasn't rich, and he didn't have connections in the world of car dealerships or business. But he had something more powerful: determination and the will to make things right. He wasn't going to let Tom's behavior define the outcome. He knew he had the power to change things, even if it meant taking risks he had never imagined before. James had worked hard his whole life to get to where he was. He wasn't about to let some racist manager take that away from him. But as he sat at his kitchen table, brainstorming ideas, a thought crossed his mind. What if he could do more than just take revenge? What if he could turn this situation into something positive, not just for himself, but for the people who faced the same struggles? What if he could use his experience to shed light on the deep-rooted racism that still existed in many industries? James knew he wasn't the only person who had faced this kind of discrimination. He wasn't the only one who had been turned away, belittled, or judged based on his skin color. And that's when it hit him. He didn't just want to expose Tom or get back at the dealership. He wanted to do something bigger. He wanted to send a message, one that would resonate far beyond that dealership. He wanted to make sure that people like Tom couldn't get away with their prejudices anymore. The next morning, he put his plan into motion. James knew he had to be strategic. The key wasn't just to return to the dealership, it was to come back in a way that would make everyone take notice. He needed to show them that he wasn't someone to be dismissed, someone they could easily overlook. He needed to show Tom that the consequences of his actions went far beyond the walls of the dealership. James did some quick research, learning more about the dealership and its ownership. He was surprised to find out that the dealership was part of a larger chain of businesses, one that had a reputation for being fair and inclusive. But as he dug deeper, he realized that even the larger organization was not immune to issues of racism. In fact, it had been reported that this dealership had been involved in multiple lawsuits over discrimination in the past. It was clear that this wasn't just Tom acting alone. It was part of a larger, systemic issue. But that also meant that James had a better chance of getting the attention he needed. With this new information, James decided to take the next step. He reached out to a local news outlet, hoping to get their attention. He didn't want to go public with his story, but he knew that exposing Tom's behavior to a larger audience would force the dealership to respond. Within hours, James had a call back. The reporter was intrigued by his story, and they agreed to meet. James felt a sense of relief. The media could amplify his voice in a way that was much stronger than anything he could do alone. He wasn't just some random customer with a complaint. He was a man who had been unjustly treated, and his story deserved to be heard. When the reporter arrived at James' apartment, they discussed the situation in detail. James shared everything that had happened the previous day, and they agreed on the next steps. James' story would go public, and the dealership would be forced to answer for its discriminatory actions. However, just as James was preparing to make his story public, he had another idea. What if he could return to the dealership the next day, not just as a customer, but as someone who could bring real change? He wanted to turn the tables on Tom, show him that James was someone who could take control of the situation, not just be a passive victim. He didn't just want to expose the manager for his racism, he wanted to take ownership, literally. James made a call to a business broker and arranged to meet with him the next morning. His plan was set. James would come back to the dealership the next day as the new owner, turning the power dynamics upside down. James knew it wasn't going to be easy. It was a bold move, one that could backfire. But he also knew that sometimes, to truly make a difference, you had to take risks. If he could pull this off, it would be the ultimate payback for Tom and a statement to everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. The morning after making his bold decision, James stood outside the dealership, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. He had come this far, he wasn't about to back down now. Armed with the knowledge that the dealership was part of a larger chain with a history of discrimination, and knowing that his story had already captured the attention of the local media, he was ready to make his move. But this was more than just about proving a point to Tom or getting back at the dealership. It was about showing the world that racism, no matter where it happens, should never be tolerated. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his worth, and his power. As he walked through the dealership's doors, the same scent of polished leather and car exhaust hit him. But this time, something felt different. The usual welcoming vibe was replaced with an undercurrent of tension. James had done his homework, and he knew the dealership's owner, the one person who had the authority to make real changes, would be there today. That's when everything was going to change. Tom was sitting at his desk when James entered, but this time, he wasn't the cocky, dismissive man James had encountered the day before. He looked up, eyes widening with surprise and a hint of guilt. His casual demeanor faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You again?" he said, with an edge of frustration in his voice. "I told you, we're not interested in your business." James remained calm, his face a mask of determination. "Actually, you're mistaken," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not here as a customer anymore. I'm here as the owner." The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. He blinked, clearly not understanding what James meant. "What are you talking about?" Tom asked, his confusion growing. "You're just some guy who—" James cut him off, smiling slightly. "I'm the new owner of this dealership. And trust me, your attitude from yesterday isn't going to fly around here anymore." Tom stood up, his face now reddening with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? Who do you think you are?" But before James could respond, the door behind him opened, and the owner of the dealership, an older man in a crisp suit, stepped into the room. The tension in the air grew thick as James turned to face him. "You must be Mr. Reynolds," James said, his tone even, but with a noticeable edge of authority. The older man, who had been listening to the conversation from the hallway, nodded. "That's right. And you are?" "I'm James. I just bought this dealership," he said, gesturing to the space around him. "And I'm here to make some changes." Mr. Reynolds paused for a moment, clearly taking in the situation. His eyes shifted between James and Tom, but there was no recognition in his expression. "You bought this dealership?" he asked, sounding skeptical but intrigued. "Yes, I did," James replied. "I've been doing my research. I know all about the past issues this dealership has had with discrimination, and I'm here to make sure that it stops now. No more discrimination. No more racism." Tom was visibly rattled now, his hands trembling as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "This is a business. You can't just come in here and make demands." But James wasn't having it. He wasn't just going to sit back and let Tom's arrogance continue to rule the dealership. "Actually," he said, "I can. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure that no one ever has to walk out of this place the way I did yesterday. No one should ever feel like they don't belong because of the color of their skin. Not in this dealership. Not anywhere." The words hit Tom hard, but it was the truth. James wasn't just talking about a personal vendetta anymore. He was talking about making a stand, about putting an end to the behavior that had been ingrained in the dealership's culture for far too long. Mr. Reynolds looked at Tom, his eyes hardening as he seemed to finally realize the magnitude of the situation. "I wasn't aware of this, Tom," he said, his voice firm. "But I can't ignore the fact that we've had complaints about discriminatory behavior before. I should have done something about this earlier." Tom, now visibly sweating, stammered. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding." "No, Tom," James interjected. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was racism, and it needs to stop." The room fell silent for a moment. James could feel the weight of the situation hanging in the air, but he knew he had won. He wasn't just confronting Tom anymore, he was confronting an entire system that had allowed such behavior to thrive. He wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. Finally, Mr. Reynolds spoke, his voice steady, but with a hint of regret. "You're right, James. We can't let this go on any longer. Tom, I think it's time for you to pack up. We'll be making changes around here, and I expect everyone to follow the new standards." Tom's face turned an angry shade of red, but there was nothing he could do now. He had been caught, and there was no way out. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had been defeated. As Tom slowly walked out of the room, James turned to Mr. Reynolds and smiled. "Thank you," he said. "I'm here to make sure things change for the better." The old man nodded, his face softening. "I'm sorry this happened, James. I'll make sure that from now on, this dealership will be a place where everyone is treated equally." As James stood there, feeling the weight of his victory, he realized that this moment wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about making sure Tom paid for his actions. It was about something much bigger. It was about sending a message. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, you deserve respect. And if people like Tom wouldn't give it to you, then you had to take it for yourself. James had turned the tables in the most unexpected way. He had gone from being a rejected customer to becoming the one who called the shots. And in doing so, he sent a message that would be felt for years to come. In the world of business, and in life, respect was something you had to earn, and James had just earned it in the most powerful way possible. The dealership had been forever changed. James stood in the office, now feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He had done what he set out to do. Not only had he taken down the man who had insulted him, but he had also shown everyone that racism had no place in this world. Tom, now a distant memory, had been removed, and the dealership was on a new path. No longer would it be a place where people of color were treated as second-class citizens. With Mr. Reynolds' support, James began working on creating an environment where equality and respect were the foundation of every transaction. He wasn't just a business owner, he was a symbol of change. The message was clear: actions have consequences, and when faced with injustice, standing up makes all the difference. And as for James, his revenge wasn't just sweet, it was justice served. If you want to hear more shocking stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.